Hello. Well, I think that's the first rush of people in, and welcome to those still joining us. Welcome to this event on the book Vulture Capitalism, which I have here with me: Corporate Crimes, Backdoor Bailouts, and the Death of Freedom. And our event tonight is Grace Blakeley, the author of the book, and the legendary Jeremy Corbyn in conversation. And we'll be talking about this book, which says on the back, and I quote, "Why everything you know about capitalism is wrong." I'd like to welcome you all to this event on behalf of Arise, the Festival of Ideas. Please, Festival of Left Ideas even, please do follow our social channels. And if you haven't done already with your ticket, please do make a donation, or even better, become a friend of Arise with a monthly gift, as each of these events costs hundreds of pounds for us to put on each time. And I know so many of you do enjoy them. Also, if you can, please in the Q&A box, tell us where you're tuning in from, and we'll do some shout outs. But it's also nice to see, for all of us involved, where people are tuning in from all around the country, but also I see in Mexico and other places around the world. And as the event goes on, please also do retweet and Facebook share the stream so your friends can join in too. And please also put any questions you have for Grace and Jeremy about the book into the Q&A function. In the Vulture Capitalism, Grace, who'll be familiar to many of you, an acclaimed journalist, writer, and campaigner, who we recently saw tear apart the the elite's political establishment's consensus on a number of issues on Question Time very powerfully. You see Grace take on the world's most powerful corporations, showing how the causes of our modern crisis are in fact the intended result of our capitalist system itself. Her essential point in that sense being it's not broken, it's working exactly as planned. I've nearly finished this book, and as Ha-Joon Chang says on the back, read this book if you want to make fundamental changes to the world. Without any further ado, I'm delighted to pass over to Grace for the introduction to the event this evening.
Thanks so much, Matt. And thanks everyone for signing up and for being here. It's great to see so many people at the event tonight, and it's going to be great to have a chat with Jeremy as well. Oh, and there he is. I can see he's just popped on the call. I'm not gonna, Jeremy's already actually heard me make this speech once already, because he very graciously came to my book launch at the South Bank Centre. So I'll try and cover some of the areas that I didn't cover that evening, particularly surrounding the question of empire, which I really wanted to get onto, and I know is of a particular source of interest for Jeremy and something that we can cover in our conversation. So basically, the thrust of the book is an argument that capitalist systems aren't free market systems, as many people have been led to believe, as we're kind of generally taught in the mainstream media, in education. Whenever we're talking about capitalism, we often come around to this idea that capitalism is the same as free markets. In my book, Vulture Capitalism, I argue that capitalism is not a free market system. It is a system based on a substantial amount of centralized planning. Now, a lot of you will be familiar with this idea that there's this distinction between kind of free market capitalist societies on the one hand and centrally planned socialist societies on the other hand. And very crudely, this tends to boil down to the idea that capitalist societies are based on, free markets, freedom, democracy, with the kind of hallmark of that being like the US during the Cold War. And the opposite system is the USSR, where the state kind of decides everything. And this was the big divide that structured really the world economy during the Cold War. And it's based on this idea that socialism basically is when the state does stuff, and capitalism is when the market does stuff. And this was something that was really pushed by the neoliberals. So people who came to power in the 1980s, like Margaret Thatcher, Ronald Reagan, their argument was that the government has become too big, the state has become too big, and to create more space for the market, to promote efficiency, and crucially, to promote human freedom, we need to curtail the size of the state and expand the reach of the market. So through privatizing formerly state-owned industries, through kind of changing regulation, cutting taxes, etc. All of this was structured around the idea that you had, the market over here, and that needed to be expanded, and that needed to be expanded, and the state over here, and that needed to be shrunk. And this dichotomized way of viewing capitalism creates a lot of traps for us, I think, on the left, because we end up falling prey to this idea that the neoliberals push, capitalism is this free market system, and that when you kind of shrink the state or increase the power of the state, that tends to lead to socialism, right? I remember part of the reason I wrote this book was going on TV after during the kind of lockdown period. And a lot of kind of broadcasters presented me with the same sets of questions. They were like, oh, well, you campaigned for Jeremy Corbyn to be leader of the Labour Party. Now we've got the government spending loads of money in the economy. Doesn't that mean you basically got what you wanted? You got socialism because the government's doing lots of stuff to maintain and sustain the economy. And I realized that this came back to this really deep misconception that people have of socialism as stuff the government does, and, you know, capitalism is stuff that happens in the free market. So I kind of aim to really take apart this idea and instead to argue that capitalism isn't about free markets. Capitalism, from a Marxist perspective, is a system based on the social division of labor. Now, what does that mean? So when we think about capitalism as a free market system, it comes back to the very earliest thinkers who wrote about capitalism, people like Adam Smith and David Ricardo. And they studied the exchanges that took place within the market. So they would say, you know, there's loads of butchers and bakers, and they all come together in this little marketplace and they exchange goods and services. And the magic of the free market is that it comes up with a price that makes sure there's a balance between supply and demand. And this is the magic of competition. That's what makes capitalism so great. Marx looked at that writing and said, okay, well, great, that's how markets work. But how do we get the commodities that are being traded in those markets? Where do the goods come from? And so he said we have to enter the hidden abode of production. So we have to look at businesses, what goes on inside them and how they produce things. And when you start to look inside corporations, which are, you know, the structuring institutions of capitalism, that's when you find this thing called the social division of labor. What does that mean? It means that some people own all the stuff that we need to produce everything, and everyone else has to sell their labor power in order to survive. So there's this division between capital and labor, between bosses, basically, and workers. And that is that's the thing that defines capitalism, basically, not the extent of the market, because the market, as we've seen, kind of, you know, predates capitalism, and not, you know, the power of the state as the defining feature of socialism, because states can be very active in capitalist economies in service of the interests of the powerful. So what vulture capitalism looks at is how and why capitalist societies don't abide by this logic of a free market system, and how actually states often step in to support capitalists rather than, you know, this idea that everything the state does is basically socialism that we saw often repeated during COVID-19. And I use a lot of examples to illustrate this point, but I think one of the best examples at the moment is the example of Boeing. So many of you will have seen Boeing has been beset by a bunch of scandals, the door blowing off one of its planes recently. Even, you know, a few years ago in 2018, 2019, you had the 737 MAX disasters where 2 Boeing planes plummeted out of the sky, killing nearly 350 people. At first, Boeing tried to blame the pilots, but it later transpired that the issue was to do with the manufacture of the planes. It was to do with a software feature of the planes that caused the nose to dive out of the sky. It later transpired that senior executives at Boeing had known about this issue, but had basically done nothing about it, that whistleblowers had come forward to say there were problems with the plane, that the regulator had been terrified to certify the plane. But because of this philosophy of self-regulation, Boeing was being regulated by workers paid by Boeing who worked within a unit that sat within Boeing. So this was, you know, the move towards self-regulation. And the company had spent huge amounts of money and resources lobbying regulators to reduce regulation over the airlines under the guise of this argument that no airline manufacturer would ever manufacture a plane that would fall out of the sky. They would be very, very careful because doing so would damage their reputation, i.e. the market will fix everything. But we don't live in a free market society. So first and foremost, Boeing doesn't operate in a competitive market. There are basically 2 firms that manufacture planes, Boeing and Airbus. And they don't compete in the way that you would normally expect in a free market scenario. Instead, they basically kind of crush all those under their power. They use the immense power they have over the market to actually shape the market rather than be shaped by the market. So what does that look like? It looks like crushing unions, cutting out costs as far as possible, creating kind of deals with other players in the market to consolidate their market power, and crucially, creating really close relationships with the state. So we have this problem. Boeing created this plane that fell out of the sky. its executives knew about it, did nothing about it, and it wasn't being regulated properly and was actually using its profits to manipulate the government not to do anything. So shouldn't we just say, well, the government should do something about it? The government should be regulating it better. All of these problems could be fixed if we just move towards this kind of regulated capitalism where politicians curb the excesses of the free market to move us towards a fairer system. That's often what you find kind of liberal progressives arguing. The problem with that idea is that markets and states aren't separate. So politicians and business leaders work together to maintain the power and privilege of those at the top. And you see this very clearly with Boeing. Boeing was one of the biggest recipients of corporate welfare, so it got massive amounts of money in tax breaks and subsidies from the US government. It had massive contracts with the US state, with various different departments of the US state. It was integrally tied to the US military industrial complex. It, as I've mentioned, spent a huge amount lobbying. There was a revolving door between the upper echelons of Boeing and the American state. And even after the 737 MAX disasters, during the COVID-19 pandemic, this time where allegedly governments were doing so much that it actually was leading to socialism, according to some people, Boeing actually managed to get a massive bailout from the American state because it was doing so badly in the wake of the 737 MAX disasters and with the decline of air travel, that the government just rode to the rescue and saved it, despite all of these massive flaws that had become very, very obvious in the wake of these disasters. So what the case study of Boeing shows is, firstly, capitalism is a free market system, isn't a free market system. Boeing wasn't operating in a free market. Secondly, markets and states aren't separate. Politics and economics aren't separate. You can't look at the market and think, oh, this is a nice self-regulating sphere, and then over here you have the government, and the government kind of, intervenes in the market to make it work properly. That's not how capitalism works. Capitalism is based on a fusion of public and private power in service of the interests of those at the top. So the state often, well, mostly, acts to augment the power and wealth of the very wealthiest, and equally corporations act within the state to advance their interests, as well as, having all of this power over society as a whole, so having power over workers, over climate, over whether or not they pay tax. And what you see when you view capitalism from this perspective, so not as based on free markets versus the state, but as based on the domination of capital over society as a whole throughout all social institutions, whether that's in corporations, in the state, in finance, and international organizations, then you start to see that actually the only way to kind of combat the concentrated economic, political, and social power of these people is not to kind of say the government will do it for us, or we'll kind of elect a nice politician and then they'll sort it out. All we have to do is kind of vote for someone different once every 4 years, or equally that we can expect corporations to suddenly start adopting corporate social responsibility and being nice and good. These very powerful figures aren't going to change a system that fundamentally works for them. The only way that we change this system is by changing the balance of power in society. So if society is divided into, these groups, then the job of the left is to augment the power of the majority versus the power of the few, versus the influence of the few. Now, part of that does rely on party political organizing, but much more of it involves creating a self-confident, movement within the rest of society that's capable of pushing back against the power of these elites. The problem with, one of the biggest problems with the kind of economy and society that we've built today is that those at the top are, as I've said in the book, capable of planning, but without any democratic accountability. They don't have discipline from the market in the form of competition, and they don't have that constraint that democracy is supposed to impose on those at the top. So they're basically able to get away with murder, which literally, we saw in the case of Boeing. So the question then becomes, right, how can we constrain the power of those at the very top of society? And again, that comes to building movements. And the thing I identify in the book as the biggest barrier to that process of movement building is individualism. So you'll see, when you read the book, that those at the top are very, very good at cooperating. businesses who are supposed to be competing are cooperating. Politicians are cooperating with business leaders. Business leaders are cooperating with financiers. There's a very powerful sense of solidarity amongst those who basically govern our society. But they have spent a lot of time and energy trying to make us feel divided in the face of their power. So we feel like we're all isolated, atomized consumers who are competing with one another, not cooperating to kind of, organize in a union to take back power from our boss, but instead just competing and like edging each other out the way with our sharp elbows and investing in our own personal capital or investing in our own, financial portfolios rather than trying to cooperate. So you have a very powerful collective organization at the top of society, and then an isolated, atomized mass of people everywhere else. And when people are isolated, they don't understand their own power. They don't see all the ways in which they're able to resist their exploitation. And instead, they end up with these feelings that you see all the time now of hopelessness, powerlessness. Politicians are all the same. Society is corrupt, but there's nothing I can do about it. And if we don't translate those feelings into a social movement, they end up basically augmenting the power of the far right, because the far right preys on this sense of powerlessness and says, vote for me, Donald Trump, because I will take revenge on the people who have made you feel less powerful. And by voting for me, you can, project your political agency onto me. I will make America great again. I will make you feel great again. And I will give a kicking to the kind of elites who are, in control often of many of the structures that govern your life. Of course, it never works out that way, but that's the narrative that they give. The alternative is to say, respond to those feelings of powerlessness by saying, let's get together and do this ourselves. Let's join in and participate in political movements. If you're not getting paid enough, rather than taking out a high interest payday loan, join a union and work with your other co-workers to demand a wage increase from your boss. If you're unhappy with what's going on in our democracy, which most people are, if you have really strong preferences about a particular area of policy, get out, protest, organize with people, join social movements that are working on that area of social policy. If you are dissatisfied with what's going on in your local community, join campaigns to build different types of community organizations, like what we're seeing in, for example, Preston with the community wealth building agenda. And all of these things are aimed at doing what I think that we really need to do, which is making politicians as scared of the people who vote for them as they are of the people giving them the money. And on that note, I'm going to hand over to Jeremy to let him respond and ask any questions that he may have.
Thanks, Grace, and what a pleasure it is to be on this call with you. And thank you for the book. And I did come to the launch at the South Bank, which was absolutely astounding. The idea that on a Sunday evening in the South Bank, you'd have a whole hall full of hundreds of people listening to you give a very acceptable and good description of what Marxism is about in terms of people's modern and lived experience, which I just thought was absolutely brilliant. So I just want to say thank you very much for that and what you have written. It sort of leads me on to the paucity of understanding of what political philosophy is about by much of the mainstream media, because they always assume that, as you quite rightly said, that socialism equals lots of spending of money and lots of control by the state and very little else. And so when I proposed in the 2019 election that we give free access to broadband, which seemed to me sort of perfectly sensible, not particularly expensive thing to do, the Daily Mail had this banner headline saying Corbyn brings in broadband communism. I'm still struggling with this one and what they actually meant by that. But behind it all, of course, is the more fundamental question that you just raised about what we mean by socialism, because it is presented as either a sort of statism where the state is all seeing, all knowing, all providing, all employing and everything else, versus the sunny uplands of an open, free, democratic society based on free market capitalism. Well, open free market democratic capitalist societies such as the United States consign millions of people to absolute poverty, deny millions more access to any kind of health services, and run an economy that is essentially exploitative both of its own natural resources and the rest of the world, and is intrinsically destructive of its own natural world and environment. And we're sort of told somehow or other it's good for us to have these free market economic entities such as Boeing or others. Well, I think the chapter in your book about Boeing is so good, I would recommend it to anyone. It points out that Boeing is, of course, a huge corporation, effectively in a near monopoly position of aircraft production in the USA, certainly for the large wide-bodied planes anyway. And that it has a very close relationship with the US government, and most of its research is actually paid for by the US defense budget. And the idea that there's a sort of global competition between Boeing and Airbus is only true to a certain degree, because both companies produce huge numbers of aircraft. They're both essentially similar types and sizes of planes, and both have very full order books and cannot possibly complete the orders they've got with any foreseeable future at the present time, which opens the way up for a Chinese involvement in the big aircraft manufacturing of the future. The difference between Boeing and Airbus is that Airbus is a conglomeration of European countries and companies, and there is a huge direct government involvement in it. Indeed, it was set up by government, and it came from the originally publicly, in the British sense, in the originally publicly owned British Aircraft Corporation. In the case of Boeing, it is an immensely profitable organization that is prepared to cut corners all along the way, hence its serious problems over the Supermax 737 and 757 and the loss of life as a result of it. And so if anyone wants to sort of think that a global free market enterprise is automatically a good thing, think the safety of planes, think the safety of that, and think the cost cutting that went in and the pressure that was put on those workers to produce very quickly, cut corners. Why? In order to increase the profitability of Boeing at the expense of manufacturing safety and proper safety checks. Today in Parliament, we had a statement about a serious case of water pollution in the southwest of England, where 250 people have now got very serious diarrhea conditions as a result of farmyard slurry being mixed up somehow along the line with drinking water through allegedly a faulty valve in a farm somewhere in Devon near Brixham. And 16,000 homes are told to boil their water. Obviously, I hope that the problem has now been fixed, and I hope that those people who are suffering and the further sufferings that will come from other people are resolved very quickly. But that calls into question the whole issue of a privatized monopoly like water. Water is something we all need. There is no competition in water. There is a production and provision of water by water companies who are encouraged to make as much as they can out of it all with very light touch by Ofwat, and that ends up with the sale of assets, pollution of our rivers, pollution of our seas, because they're not prepared to invest in the very necessary double piping to ensure that sewage is never mixed with any other water that can go into rivers and seas. And so that is the pollution that we're causing, again, by a privatized system. So I think there's questions there. So then people say, well, what do you actually mean by socialism? Well, in its purest form, socialism is from each according to their means to each according to their needs. And that does not necessarily mean that everything has to be publicly owned. And so I was asked this question at a discussion at London Met University last week. They said, is there anything that you think should be produced by the private sector as opposed to the public sector? And I said, well, actually, I'm not in favor of public ownership of everything. That's not my point. The point is about the basis on which a society operates. You can have a society where quite a lot is publicly owned and publicly produced. It doesn't make it a fair or socialist society. All it means is that you've got some areas of production that are publicly owned, sometimes for good reason, like the way in which the steel industry and the aircraft industry and the shipbuilding industry were brought into public ownership in the 1970s in order to invest in them and make them a stronger and more appropriate industry of the future. Or you can go into this sort of free market idea in which an awful lot of highly skilled people will lose their jobs, and you'll follow the Thatcherite model of worshipping money rather than what we actually need in society. To me, socialism is in part a state of mind. It is about a sense of attitudes, and it is about a determinant in our society that we will not destroy the natural world and the environment. We will not tolerate horrible levels of poverty. We will not tolerate rough sleeping, homelessness, and we will ensure that our children are not brought up in a very competitive society in school, which means you have winners and losers before they even reach taking GCSE, and many children are then consigned to underachievement for the rest of their lives and not necessarily very happy lives as a result of it. So to me, what your book does is calls into question so much of the assumptions that are made in both directions, and how we shouldn't ever be afraid to talk about what we mean by socialism. And the last thing I'll say on this is, I want to live in a socialist society, in a socialist world. I want to see a world that protects itself from natural disasters and pollution and so on. But I also want to see a world that isn't so riven by inequality, both within our own society and at a global level. At the moment, we have a political and economic determinant on both sides of the Atlantic and across most of Europe that worships individual wealth, that worships sharp-elbowed achievement, that doesn't care about the environment, doesn't care about the poorest, and sees the rest of the world beyond the shores of North America and Europe and some parts of Asia as being ripe for exploitation. Thus, the Congo is a provider of natural resources for the rest of the world, but woe betide any government of the Congo that wants to invest in housing, in education, in health, and in the good futures of the people of Congo, and woe betide any government that challenges the way in which mining companies benefit from the work of child labor, for example. And so we have to be much more global in what we do. And what I like about Grace's book is the way it's written, a very engaging way in which she describes the economic struggles we're in, and the way in which the most important thing is to exist in a world of solidarity. That means getting people to join a trade union. And so that means campaigning for the principle of union membership. I mean, I go to some sixth forms and colleges, and I'm talking glibly about this union, that union, and so on. And they sort of hand goes up like, I say, what do you want? I say, excuse me, what's a union? What? A 15-year-old says, what's a union? They've never heard of the concept before, and they didn't know what it was for. All they know is that the subheading on the very brief news broadcasts on commercial radio are that unions cause something. Unions never defend anything, they cause something, like a strike, like a delay, whatever. And so it is up to us about understanding and about education. And that's what Grace's book does so well. And she describes it so well. So I do urge all of you to buy the book, read it, if you're able to. I haven't got the time to read it, but it's a great read. It's very well written, and that will give you a sense of empowerment and above all a sense of hope, because hope is something that you can't measure, you can't provide except by example and by action. And this book provides the example and the action, which brings hope to a generation that particularly a young generation that is now beset by debt, beset by a sense of hopelessness of housing and where they're going to live, and beset by a sense of fear about their work and their place in society in the future. Most people are only 1 or 2 paychecks away from homelessness in many parts of this country. That is not a secure, happy, democratic society. Democracy is when you protect everybody. So I think we need to go into a bit of discussion. You okay with that, Grace, or do you want us to go on longer together, or should we take some
No,
points?
please open up questions.
That's over to Matt to do that, isn't it? Matt.
Yeah.
Speak on, Matt. You're in charge, mate.
Hello. Oh God, I wouldn't recommend that.
Well, you are in charge for the moment.
Yeah, could be fired and rehired maybe. So yeah, so
What makes you think you'd be rehired? Joke,
So,
joke. Please don't quote me.
so just thank you both. Of course, there are thousands of people tuning in. And I'm quite excited to just look at some of the international places we've got on with us, which includes Brazil, France, India, Mexico, South Africa, Slovakia, and Spain. And of course, it's one of the advantages of online discussions. It's great to see people from all over the world. Just drawing your attention, everyone, to a few things in the chat. First, as Jeremy said, it's very important we all buy this book, which I've got with me here, and the link should be in the chat to buy the copy direct. Please do it today. It's a few of you asking about Arise Festival in the chat. Our next event is on 40 years since the miners' strike. It's called Class War in Britain, and it's an all-afternoon event on Saturday, June the 1st. So please do look at the details of that and subscribe. And this, as I said earlier, please, if you can, do make a donation to Arise, and even better, become a friend of Arise, so we can keep holding these events. Now, in terms of questions, I've got a few up in front of me.
Matt, before you go into questions, can I very rudely interrupt you for 1 second?
Good.
Oh, okay. Just to pay, because you since you're advertising the Rise Festival, which I'll certainly be at, please bear in the back of your mind, September the 14th, Peace and Justice Project International Conference, be at Queen Mary College in the East End of London, online as well as a physical one. And it will include discussions, and I'm hoping that Grace is going to be speaking there as well. So there's a lot, thumbs up, you see what I mean? So just put it in your mind, September the 14th, all day, online as well as physical. It's going to be great, and we'll have a large number of people there, and we'll have speakers from Brazil, South Africa, India, and so on, all around the world speaking out. It's going to be good. Sorry, Matt, back to you.
No, that's fine. And if the volunteers can make sure to put the PPJ links in the chat, then people can follow them directly. I've chosen a group of questions, and then I'll let you two sort of move where you want with them. Some are more economicsy, shall we say, and some are a bit more general, all taken from our viewers on Zoom. So in no particular order, I've got one from Ruth on Zoom, who asks, what are your thoughts on the free ports and special economic zones popping up all over the UK, and not just all over the UK, it has to be said. Eric, a wild goose, asks, how can we get economics to change when Labour win general election? A more specific one here from Aman in Wrexham, who says to Grace, how do you think the points in your book can break through to normal people, considering capital's stranglehold on the media? And then for now, one other one that I really like is from Jerry from Woking on Zoom, who a lot of people will know, who asks, where are the collective spaces in society for organising now? Party members of any party, I'm presuming he means any party, but just as party members, are a small percentage of the population. Even activists in general are a small percentage of the population, and trade union membership is super low. Into what space can we invite people who are not politically active to be in solidarity with us, brackets the many? Thanks, Jerry, and others there for your questions. So if I kick them back to you, Grace, first of all.
Yeah, thanks. Oh, thanks so much, guys. I'm really just like overwhelmed by how many people there are, by Jeremy's fantastic remarks, by all the wonderful solidarity and interest that is being displayed here. So yeah, thanks everyone for coming along. To take those questions one at a time, special economic zones and free ports. Fascinating topic. Quinn Slobodian's book, Crack Up Capitalism, is very good on this. And I think what the free ports and special economic zones show is that we live in a world in which has a lot of freedom for capital, and very little freedom for everyone else, right? And that is part of the way that imperialism at the level of the global economy is reinforced and maintained. So there's a whole chapter in my book on empire, and this is basically about how production is concentrated in the global south amongst very poor working class people who are paid very, very low wages. This idea that everyone is now middle class is wrong. There has been a growing middle class in rich countries, but that's just because the global working class is concentrated in poor countries, and in rich countries, you have the owners of the means of production, very wealthy and powerful, massive multinational corporations, banks, politicians that work with them, and a managerial class, lawyers, accountants, professional services that supervise a global production process, keeping everyone in their place, making sure the money flows around it. But the actual production all still takes place with very poor workers in the global south. How is this system policed? Lots of different ways. International law is used very selectively to make sure that the world economy is very porous for capital. So it's very easy for capital to move around, very difficult for workers to move around. And free ports and special economic zones are a perfect encapsulation of this logic, because the idea is that you take a section of a country, let's say, you know, a free port in the United Arab Emirates, and you make it completely exempt from, you know, regulation, taxes, labor laws. You create this kind of mini capitalist paradise where no one actually lives, because as soon as you do things like strip away taxes, strip away labor laws, if you were to do that in a whole economy, there would be mass rebellion. So instead, you take a little parcel of the world and you make this haven for capitalists. And in doing so, you kind of suck capital into these tiny little zones, because capital can move anywhere it likes, whereas workers are fixed. And how do you make sure workers are fixed? Very rigid border policies, make it very difficult for people to move around the world, whilst it's very easy for capital to move around the world. And so SEZ, special economic zones, are one of the ways that that happens. But so are, you know, the mobility of capital, the removal of exchange controls, all of the system of international regulation that governs the financial system. I look at it all in the chapter on empire for those of you who are interested. The second question was, what was the second question again, Matt?
Second question was,
I'll cover these quite briefly so we can go to Jeremy.
Was on I've got too many messages coming in here. So
economic policies and the Labour Party.
How can we get economics to change when Labour win the election? Then the next one was, how do you think the points in your book can break through to normal people considering capital's stranglehold on the media? Yeah. And then the final one was the one about sort of organising and spaces, collective spaces.
I actually think I can kind of answer all three of these together, because they kind of hinge on similar sorts of things, right? Which is, you know, we live in a world where political and economic power are fused and deployed to maintain and reinforce the status quo. So what are the kind of weapons that we have in our arsenal to push back against this system, if we can't kind of just rely on the idea that one set of institutions, let's say, you know, the government, is going to protect us from what's going on in the economy? Instead, we have to build people power, right? So, you know, the Labour Party, for example, when they win the next election, they're not going to listen to the, you know, demands of ordinary people unless those people are organised. I said this in an interview with The Times the other day. People have to, you know, politicians have to be as scared of people voting for them as they are of the people giving them money. And currently they're not. They're much more scared of the bond markets or, you know, their wealthy donors than they are of ordinary people. Why is that? It's because we're fragmented and atomized. And we're fragmented and atomized for a number of different reasons. Firstly, this was always the intent of neoliberal thinkers and politicians. They said they wanted to shrink the state and expand the market. That was never what they wanted to do. They made the state very big and generous for the wealthy, but they used the power of the state to crush working class organizing. So they crushed the unions, they decimated communities, and they just, you know, have used extraordinary police power to break up demonstrations, to really counter any protest movement. Why? Because they are scared of people power. The other thing they've done is an ideological shift. They've encouraged us all to think of ourselves as isolated mini consumers, you know, consumers of public services, not citizens, as entrepreneurs, not workers. Just to think of ourselves as in our own little bubbles where we, you know, acquire assets and we balance them off against debts, and our whole life is this balance sheet of assets and liabilities, and it's up to us to manage it. And if we do it badly, it's our own fault. We only have ourselves to blame. And if we do it well, then we're brilliant, successful entrepreneurs. Now, of course, that isn't how the system works. There are entrenched advantages for some and disadvantages for others that mean that, you know, this hierarchy remains relatively rigid. So, you know, the question of like how we push back against this, it really requires us to adopt, as Jeremy was saying, a different kind of mindset. And this again links to how do we get involved, right? Because it is true that a small percentage, a relatively small percentage of the population is politicized. So how do we politicize people? Number one is pushing back against individualism. And what does that mean? That means showing people that we don't actually live in a world where everyone is naturally competitive, isolated, pushing each other out the way to get to the top. We don't live in a world where advantage is earned, where the rich have earned their place at the top, whereas the poor deserve to be there. We live in a world of entrenched privilege and power. And the only way to push back against that is to recognize that human beings are as cooperative, at least as cooperative as we are competitive. And how do you show people that? You pull them in to social organizations, to social movements. Now, that can be anything from a big protest, but a lot of people are scared to show up at those protests. So on a very local level, how do you do that? How do you politicize people? I volunteer at my local food bank, right? And that brings me into contact with a whole variety of people with all sorts of different concerns, very different kinds of lives. But they all kind of share this mutuality and cooperative attitude that means that they can be politicized. And, you know, we all can and should try to do that. So, you know, that's a very micro thing. There's also tenants unions. There's, you know, getting involved in your labor union, getting involved in the climate movement. Loads and loads of options for you. And I actually look at a lot of them in my book, but in the end of Vulture Capitalism. And there's another book I think that Jeremy knows as well, which is It's Not That Radical by Michaela Loach, that has a lot of examples as to how you can do that. So, yeah, I think really the first thing is getting people politicized, not by kind of shouting political slogans at them, but by pulling them into movements that give them a sense of belonging and collective power.
Over to you for those questions, Jeremy.
Thanks. I'll be brief so we get time to bring lots of other people in. I mean, I'm glad Grace just mentioned Michaela Loach's wonderful book. It's Not That Radical. She was really impressive presentation of the book. I was out in Brighton the other week, and we coincided it with a promotion of our book Poetry for the Many. So we got into discussion about imagination and artistic endeavor amongst people. And that's why I think that any discussion about the kind of world we want to live in also has to look at the artistic, the musical, and the poetic and the literary and the imagination, because that is what ultimately brings about confidence and change. And the first question we got was on free ports. Well, a free port is essentially a tax-free zone that's created by a government in order to persuade a global corporation or somebody to move in there, be exempt from an awful lot of laws and property taxes and a number of other taxes as well. And a lot of workers' rights protection is lost within these free zones, and they open up. So you think of this, you put a couple of free zones at free port zones in Scotland, and a couple in Northern Ireland, a couple in the south of England, maybe one in Redcar, and that's great. Then somebody across the channel does exactly the same thing, only offers an even bigger giveaway, even less taxes, even less regulation, even less workers' protection. And so the whole horrible saga goes on of a beggar thy neighbour policy running all around. And that is where this whole policy leads us to. And I think free ports are an illusion of investment, an illusion of development, when in reality they're an escape from the social obligations to pay your taxes and provide decent quality workers' protection at the place of employment. And so when in major industries were under threat, particularly in the 70s and 80s, what was the response of the then Thatcher government was to basically monetize everything, so that if you produce things in your society which made steel, which is used for manufacturing just about everything, That's one thing. You could just as easily run a casino, which made money, which for a few people, or you could just as easily produce weapons or anything else. There was no social value on anything. All that was placed was on the ability to make money out of something. And so my worry is that the general election debate on the economy won't be about redistribution of power, redistribution of wealth, empowerment of people to control and run their own economy by a public investment, by cooperatives, and by promotion of shorter working week and better working conditions and all those things. Instead, it will just be the growth of yet more individualism and yet more inequality within our society, more billionaires and more people without anything in order to survive by. So there has to be an alternative, which is why Grace's book is very valuable. Michaela's book is very valuable. The whole points that Matt is making frequently in all the stuff that you do on Arise is about offering people an economic alternative that gives hope to people. The danger of the tyranny of averages is a very bad thing. You could look at an average income across society and say, well, okay, average wages have gone up. An average, all it means is that the median point has gone up compared to what it was before. It doesn't tell you what the levels of inequality are within our society. It doesn't tell you how many more people are completely removed from economic activity, living without any discernible income at all, or living in absolute poverty, or the number of billionaires that have been created. The point that was asked about appealing to normal people. I'm always a bit nervous about the use of the word normal people. I mean, I don't know anybody that's normal. I know plenty of people that have lots of wonderful and powerful abnormalities about them. We've all got abnormalities about us. So I don't want to call people normal. What I do want to do is ensure that we give people some sense of hope. And so that's the point that Jerry was making on the last question. The whole philosophy that I did my best to push into the Labour Party was one, firstly, of gaining mass membership of the party, and membership did get up to 600,000, but also to make the party a relevant community-based force in all of our communities, so that Labour was involved in all communities, in all campaigns, the ones you win and the ones you don't win, defending a hospital, trying to get a nursery, protecting a park, getting a new park, electrifying a railway, shorter working week, union recognition, whole lots of things. As you win any campaign, everybody feels stronger as a result of it. They feel empowered as a result of it. So what you win isn't given from above, it's achieved by yourselves. That means you have to have democratic expression within your politics. And that is something that is not just in decline, it's been completely removed from an awful lot of people, both within political parties and to some extent, sometimes even in unions as well. There has to be the ability to democratically express and empower people. That means thinking about what goes on in our schools. Our children need to be brought up questioning things, questioning what they're told, questioning what the narrative of the history is, and understanding that history shows us what people have achieved against the most appalling odds. When I give this example often, that you can look at the abolition of the slave trade and slavery in Britain in two ways. One is this lovely man, William Wilberforce, very nice, liberal Tory, was very worried about the slave trade, so went to Parliament and proposed a bill to abolish it. And just along the way, he happened to compensate all the slave owners for not being slave owners any longer. Or you can look at it another way. Slavery was abolished because of the slave uprisings, principally in Jamaica, and that caused problems for the sugar sellers in London. That caused problems for the shareholders, and they then realized that at that level the game was up and they would have to support abolition, and then very carefully negotiated for themselves massive levels of compensation. What really caused the end of the slave trade Was it Wilberforce, or was it those very brave people, many of whom were killed in the process in the western parts, particularly of Jamaica? So it's about how we learn our history, and history indeed then forms our opinions on so much else. And so I think we've got to push back against individualism, push for collective answers and collective solutions. Housing, look at it as a collective answer by the provision of good quality, reliable, affordable, secure council housing, not the horrors of the free market and the private rented sector, which is so devastating for the lives of so many people, particularly younger people.
Thank you, Jeremy. Thank you, Grace. I'm going to try and get some more questions in quickly. Thank you, everyone. Someone's asking how many people are with us. It's quite hard to see, but I'd say genuinely over 2,000 people are with us across all platforms now. If I was trying to spin it, I could perhaps put a higher figure on the social media numbers, but people who do a lot of work with it know they're not always particularly reliable. A few people in the Q&A mentioning about student encampments on Gaza, and they've been to visit them and so on. And just to say, it was great to see Jeremy at one of them in London recently. I saw, and just a massive solidarity, I think, from everyone on this call to all those people who are speaking up for a free Palestine in these student encampments all over the world. It's so inspiring what you're doing. Also, a thank you to John on this call, who's just become a friend of the Rise Festival. Much appreciated, John, and doing it while you're on the call. That's the way to go. And a thank you to all our volunteers. In terms of these last, I've sort of got two topics and two questions in the first one that are linked, and then a final one that I'll ask all in one now, and then Grace and Jeremy, perhaps in reverse order. So we'll go to Jeremy first, and then Grace can sum up as well. I think a lot of the questions that have been put in differently are about like actual examples of alternatives and economic alternatives. And something that came up to me reading the book was perhaps to ask both your thoughts on the Lucas plan, which is something that Grace looks into in a book. But I think it's very significant as an example for us at this time, when more and more money is being piled into a war machine that apparently we're not allowed to talk about. But we aren't doing the green transition programs that everyone knows is needed. And also something else that comes on the book is some ideas about international spaces for economic alternatives, planning from Latin America and elsewhere, which both our speakers are interested in, might want to reflect on. And then Ray on Zoom, which I think again is linked to the idea of what our alternatives said, isn't the problem with state ownership. Historically, I think he means the lack of workers' control, which I think is an important point. How do we democratize changes we want to make to the economy? And then a final one here from Mary on Zoom, who asks, in seeking to build a movement, the kind of movement that Grace and others on the call have been talking about, how do we promote a degree of unity among the many? We are so easily divided amongst ourselves by differences in wealth, income, classes, and so many other things that militate against unity. And I suppose that's always been the $1 million question for those of us on the left. And if we had an easy answer, that would be great. So it's a great question, though, Mary, and thank you to everyone who's put in the Q&A, your questions. I hope we've got to a lot. And back over to Jeremy now.
Matt, I love the question or the comment that's put there from somebody called iPhone about having people's forums and the numbers of people in them. Like they're starting to say 100 people coming to each forum. I think that's an absolutely brilliant idea, because Grace was talking earlier about her volunteering in the food bank in her own neighborhood. That's great. And you find in food banks that obviously people that need food, but I also find that there's an awful lot of other issues that people want to raise, ranging from housing, mental health, and many other issues, but also quite a lot of people who actually feel quite lonely. They have enough income to provide their own food. So not they're looking for food, but they're looking for a sense of community and community involvement, and they feel they can find it there. And that is something that we should be very aware of and try and develop. So people's forums around any issue often brings people together. Communities either come together out of celebration and joy, which is why people often enjoy communal events that are done on public holidays, not because they necessarily want to celebrate whatever the public holiday has been called for, but because they actually feel the need to do things together. And to me, what is too often lacking on the political left in Britain is that sense of community and that sense of community involvement, and with all the idiosyncrasies that goes with it. But it actually brings people together and makes them very powerful. The unions in Brazil grew a great deal during the most difficult times, partly because they were standing up against the economic horrors of the Bolsonaro government and other, before that, very right-wing governments as well, but because they also involved the whole of the community in a struggle. So it wasn't just a wage struggle at the point of work. It was about the community as a whole, the housing, the mental health, the nurseries, the schools, and all the things that are so necessary. The question was put there on the Lucas plan. For the uninitiated, the Lucas plan was done in the 1970s. Mike Cooley particularly led the thing from, there was then AUEW TAS, and it was about a plan by shop stewards in Lucas Aerospace, which is now somewhere within British Aerospace, BAE Systems, and it was about transferring production away from weaponry into social needs. Very interesting, very powerful, very advanced stuff at the time, and we need an awful lot more of it. The government has announced that defence expenditure will rise to 2.5% of GDP, and there are moves within the Tory right and many others in the Tory party for that matter, who want to raise it to 3% of GDP, which would be the biggest increase ever, and it would be a massive level of expenditure on very advanced weaponry. I don't think we need that. I think what we need are two things: a strategy which leads towards resolution of conflict by diplomacy, by peace, by looking at the causes of war and deal with it that way, and that instead of threatening people, we do much more to stop blaming refugees for being refugees and instead start recognizing they're human beings fleeing from conflict, in some cases that this country was involved with, such as Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, Libya, and so on. And that means looking at alternatives. But this is the same applies to the Green Industrial Revolution. You're not going to get much of a hearing if you turn up at a factory that's making military aircraft, or turn up at a factory that's making diesel engines and say, you guys shouldn't be making military aircraft, you shouldn't be making diesel engines, we're going to close you down. Not going to work. You've got to go there and say, which is what we tried to do over particularly Green Industrial Revolution, is to say the community as a whole will invest in protecting your jobs, protecting your way of life, in order that we can change the production you're doing. So you're not threatening people with the loss of livelihood because you want to have a better global policy or a better environmental policy. It is about working with people along that way. And that to me is the most important message, that we don't go and threaten people. Instead, we go and support people in order to bring about those changes. So we end up, hopefully, with that sense of unity of purpose. And I think the strikes over the past year, 2 years, on the railways and post, civil service, health, teaching, have all shown something has changed, that communities as a whole will come out and support those people, because they don't see teachers as the enemy, they see teachers as the protectors of the education system. And what Grace's book helps us to do is understand the way capitalism works, and understand that Marxism is not a bad word. Marxism is an understanding of the philosophy that has developed this so-called free market capitalist society. It's not free market, but it's very definitely capitalist society, and capitalist societies create the wealth of some people and also enable the poverty of a very much larger number. Our job is to turn things around a little and make sure that the poorest are actually empowered and the richest are controlled in the power that they exercise at the present time.
And
Thanks.
Oh.
Thanks, Jeremy. Yeah, and thanks, Matt, and thank you to all those people who asked questions. I'll very quickly kind of sum up, because I think Jeremy answered a lot of them there, by just a little anecdote that I think kind of sums up how I would respond to a lot of those questions. I remember, so I did a lot of campaigning for Jeremy in 2017 and 2019. Lots of knocking on doors in all different parts of the country, going on the Labour battle bus, speaking to lots of different people in lots of different places. And I learned a lot doing that. One of the things I learned is that most people are thoroughly dissatisfied with the kind of economic model that we have. They're dissatisfied with inequality, with, climate. They're dissatisfied with politics and politicians. And, they want to see change. But when you start talking to people about change, they become suspicious. They say, there's me knocking on someone's door and saying, vote for this political party and you're going to get all these policies that are going to solve all these problems. And they think, I've had this door knock so many times before over the course of my life. I've seen all these politicians on TV promising me X and Y and Z, and then they come into office and very little changes. And it's almost as though they get more angry and frustrated and suspicious the more you promise them, because there's a little part of them that hopes that maybe this time it will be different and maybe this time things will actually change. And so they demand of you, they say, well, how is this going to be different? How can I trust you? Why should I trust you? And I thought about that a lot. And I kind of eventually came around to the idea that it was a big drawback of the left, that it was people, from positions of power going to everyone else and asking everyone else to trust us, right? That it's often politicians and intellectuals and people going out and saying, trust me, I'll make things better for you, which is a lot of the time how, leftists throughout the whole of history have operated. And this isn't a criticism of, Labour or Jeremy, of anyone. This is just the only way that we were able to articulate these ideas that people really liked. The issue wasn't that they didn't like the ideas. It was that they weren't sure they could hope to believe that these things would possibly happen. And how do you push back against that? You have to show people that change is possible now. And the only way to do that is by getting them involved in that change. So I write in the book that we can't have a socialism that is based on asking people to trust politicians. We have to have a socialism that's based on asking people to trust each other. And that means, as socialists, it's all of our jobs to get out there, get involved in our communities in any way that we possibly can, speak to people, engage them, mobilize them, show them ways into political movements, help to combat that sense of alienation, help to combat that anger, and show people that, yes, you're dissatisfied with your life, you're angry about the way this system works, but there's so much that you can do right now to actually help to change things. And when you give people that sense of power, of political agency, and a sense of like how they can trust one another to change society, that's when I think you really start to see a big shift in people's attitudes and a shift towards socialism. Because if we don't have that, we have distrust in society, anger at the state of, economics and politics. And that actually, without an alternative, tends to boost the far right rather than the far left. Capitalism's broken, but people don't know how they can change things. So I really think that the foundation of all of our policies, as amazing as they are, it has to be rooted and grounded in people's lives.
Thank you, Grace. Thank you, Jeremy. Thank you, our audience. So many people still with us. And thank you again to the volunteers. I'm looking forward to seeing Jeremy and Grace at this conference in London in September. Yep. Get a complimentary ticket. And
are you angling for a free ticket, Matt?
Exactly. And yeah, also see everyone online at the 40 Years On from the Miners' Strike event, which I'm really looking forward to on June the 1st. And in particular, don't forget to buy Grace's books and also keep on the streets for Palestine until we win peace and justice. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, Matt. Thanks, Grace.
Thank you. Bye.